Totemist.
The smiling fish. The relationship between a fisherman and the sea is one of profound intimacy, a daily dance of respect, wonder, and occasional fear. For 27 years, I navigated this relationship with quiet confidence, drawing sustenance from Santorini's azure waters, just as my father and grandfather had before me. The rhythms of tides and seasons became extensions of my own heartbeat, the gentle rocking of my small kayak more familiar than solid ground. What I'm about to share challenges everything I understood about this relationship. I hesitate to call it a story. Stories have endings, and I'm no longer certain mine has concluded. That day began unremarkably. I set out before dawn from a moody bay, the crimson cliffs of Oya still shrouded in darkness as my boat slipped into open water. Early morning departures had become more essential as tourism transformed our island, allowing me precious hours of solitude before cruise ships appeared on the horizon and the waterfront filled with visitors seeking so-called authentic Greek experiences to photograph. The fishing had been poor that week, unsettlingly so. Areas traditionally abundant with bass and bream yielded empty nets, concerning many in our small fishing community. Some blamed changing water temperatures, others the increasing boat traffic. The older fishermen spoke in hushed tones of cyclical patterns, of times when the sea held back her gifts before significant events. Earthquakes, storms, inexplicable phenomena in the deep waters between islands. The sea keeps secrets, Knossos, the oldest among us, had said the previous evening at the Caphanian. Sometimes she pulls things close to her heart, preparing to reveal something else. When pressed about what this something else might be, he merely shrugged and returned to his ouzo. His cryptic words echoed in my mind as I positioned my boat near the submerged crater edge where volcanic activity had created unique fishing grounds. 4 hours of methodical work produced a meager catch. 3 small bream and a single octopus, hardly worth the fuel expended. Frustration mounting, I decided to try deeper waters beyond my usual range. The depth finder showed 60 meters when I felt the distinctive tug on my line, not the frantic struggle of a bream or the powerful pulls of a large bass, but something deliberate. It moved with purpose, testing the tension rather than fighting against it. My curiosity overshadowed concern as I carefully reeled in my catch, adjusting tension, respecting the weight on the other end. What emerged from the water appeared at first glance to be a large bream-like fish, perhaps 40 centimeters long, with silvery scales reflecting morning sunlight. But as I lifted it into the boat, I recognized this was something I'd never encountered in nearly 3 decades at sea. The scales had an unusual pattern, almost geometric in their precision. The fins were elongated, with an articulation that seemed excessive for ordinary swimming. Most disquieting were the eyes, larger than typical for its size, with vertically elliptical pupils that constricted visibly as I observed them. Professional interest overcame my initial unease as I examined my catch more closely. The creature had no visible gills, which defied everything I understood about fish anatomy. How did it breathe underwater? A barely perceptible seam ran along its belly, resembling a healed incision more than any natural feature I recognized. When I cautiously opened its mouth to remove my hook, I discovered the most unsettling feature of all, rows of teeth that were unmistakably human. Something deep within me, some ancestral warning system that predates rational thought, urged me to return this creature to the sea. Instead, I placed it in my cooler with the day's meager catch, securing the lid with uncharacteristic firmness. The scientific mind I'd developed through years of observation argued that this could be an undocumented species, perhaps a discovery of significance. I'd show it to Marcos, whose marine biology studies had taken him to Athens University before family obligations brought him back to our island. The journey back to Amudi Bay passed in contemplative silence. I found myself avoiding the cooler, focusing instead on navigation, on the familiar landmarks of home approaching on the horizon. The luxury hotels and pools carved into the caldera cliffs emerged like white crowns above the water. Tourists, with their cameras and sunburned shoulders, began to populate my view. Reminders of the ordinary world where fish have gills and predictable teeth, where the sea gives and takes according to understood patterns. I secured my kayak in its usual spot, nodding to fellow fishermen. Something held me back from mentioning my unusual catch, perhaps the same instinct that makes us hesitate to share dreams too strange to articulate in daylight. Marcos wasn't answering his phone, so I brought my entire catch home to the small whitewashed house perched halfway up the cliffside steps. The cooler felt unreasonably heavy as I navigated the 238 familiar steps from harbor to home, though I attributed this to fatigue rather than any change in its contents. My one-room dwelling reflected the simplicity that 3 generations of my family had valued, practical rather than picturesque, though tourists often photographed its blue-trimmed windows and doorway filled with hanging octopus traps. I placed the cooler on my work table by the window overlooking the caldera, then found myself reluctant to open it immediately. Instead, I busied myself with afternoon rituals, coffee preparation, checking weather forecasts, recording the day's minimal catch in the logbook my father had started decades earlier. When I finally opened the cooler, the strange fish lay exactly as I'd placed it, though I could have sworn its eyes tracked my movement around the room. I photographed it from multiple angles, noting its measurements in my logbook with scientific detachment that belied my growing discomfort. Without Marcos's expertise, I hesitated to cut into the specimen, instead transferring it to a large glass container partially filled with seawater and ice to preserve it overnight. I placed the container on my kitchen counter, positioning it so the creature faced away from my small sleeping area. Even with this precaution, I felt observed throughout the evening as I prepared a simple meal and sat with a book. Sleep came reluctantly that night, my dreams filled with undulating patterns and structures glimpsed beneath dark waters. The wind picked up around midnight, bringing with it the distinctive sound of Santorini's microclimate, air currents channeled between islands, creating almost vocal harmonics. I'd fallen asleep to this natural music countless nights, finding comfort in its familiarity. But this night, something else interwove with the wind's voice, a soft, melodic singing in no language I recognized. I woke fully around 3 a.m, the singing distinct enough now that I couldn't attribute it to dream or wind. It came from the direction of the water, a woman's voice, or perhaps several women's voices harmonizing so perfectly they seemed as one. The melody carried notes of both melancholy and invitation, weaving patterns that made perfect emotional sense while defying musical conventions I understood. Drawn to my window, I gazed down at the bay below. The quarter moon provided just enough illumination to distinguish the outline of boats gently rocking at their moorings, the surface of the water textured by light wind. Nothing visibly unusual, yet the singing continued, seeming to emanate from just beyond the harbor entrance. "Hello?" I called softly, not expecting an answer. The singing paused momentarily, then resumed with subtle variations that somehow suggested acknowledgement of my presence. A soft tapping sound from behind me drew my attention back to the kitchen counter. The strange fish was pressed against the glass of its container, its two human mouth opening and closing in perfect synchronization with the distant singing. Its eyes, those vertical pupilled eyes, were now fully open, fixed unwaveringly on me. The rational explanations I'd constructed, rare species, genetic anomaly, even unknown deep-sea adaptation, dissolved in that moment of connection. Whatever watched me through those eyes understood me in ways I couldn't comprehend. It recognized me, not as predator or captor, but as something else entirely. "What are you?" I whispered, approaching the container cautiously. The fish's mouth formed what I can only describe as a smile, revealing those disturbing, human-like teeth. The distant singing intensified, multiple voices now clearly distinguishable, calling with increasing urgency. I backed away, colliding with my small dining table. The singing transformed, incorporating what sounded like my name, though I'd introduced myself to no one out on the water. Fear and fascination warred within me as I stood frozen between the window with its siren song and the container with its watchful inhabitant. Sleep evaded me for the remainder of the night. I sat in my chair by the window, watching the creature watching me, listening to the voices that rose and fell with the tide until they gradually faded with the approaching dawn. Only when early morning light flooded my small home did the fish finally close its eyes, appearing once again to be merely an unusual specimen. Morning brought a semblance of rationality with its familiar routines and sunlight. I convinced myself that exhaustion and isolation had magnified ordinary phenomena into something supernatural. The fish was certainly unusual, but a scientific explanation would eventually emerge. The singing must have been a combination of wind, water acoustics, and perhaps distant music from a yacht moored beyond the harbor. Yet even as I assembled these comfortable explanations, some deeper knowledge remained, a certainty that transcended evidence and reason. I needed to return to the water, to bring this creature back to wherever it had come from. Not for scientific documentation or fishermen's tales, but because boundaries had been crossed that were not meant for crossing. I prepared my boat methodically that morning, speaking to no one as I loaded minimal supplies. The container with the strange fish I wrapped in a soft cloth that couldn't fully disguise its contents. Several fellow fishermen noticed my unusual demeanor, but respectfully maintained distance, perhaps recognizing something in my expression that warranted privacy. "Returning something that isn't yours?" old Costas asked as I untied my mooring lines. His weathered face revealed no judgment, only knowing concern. "I think so," I replied, unable to elaborate further. He nodded slowly. "The sea gives gifts and tests, Alexandros. Remember your way home." He pressed something small and cold into my palm, an ancient coin he'd worn around his neck for decades, a talisman of protection he claimed had guided his grandfather safely through storms. I clutched it tightly, suddenly reluctant to depart, yet knowing I had no choice. "I'll return it tomorrow," I promised, securing the coin in my pocket. "I hope so," he said simply, turning away with the slight stoop that years at sea had carved into his posture. The journey to the deep water where I'd made my catch felt simultaneously longer and shorter than its actual duration. Time seemed to undulate like the swells beneath my hull. I positioned my boat approximately where I'd been the previous day, cut the engine, and drifted in the morning stillness, alone on the water between islands. The container felt strangely light as I unwrapped it, the fish inside now completely motionless. For a terrible moment, I feared it had expired overnight, that I'd somehow failed in a task I didn't fully understand. But as I tilted the container toward the water, those vertical pupils dilated once more, focusing on me with unmistakable awareness. "Go home," I whispered, not knowing what else to say as I emptied the container over the side. The fish didn't immediately disappear into the depths as expected. It floated at the surface, circling my boat once, twice, 3 times, each circle widening slightly. Then it paused, orienting itself to face me directly. In that moment of connection, understanding flowed between us that transcended language. Images and sensations flooded my consciousness, vast structures beneath glittering depths, communities of beings neither human nor fish, accumulated knowledge preserved through millennia of observing the surface world. They had watched us, these residents of deeper realms, as we sailed and fished and polluted and loved along coastlines we believed were ours alone. They had learned our languages, studied our behaviors, preserved records of our civilization's rise and inevitable decline. And occasionally, very occasionally, they selected individuals to join them, to serve as bridges between realms, translators of experience. The fish submerged with barely a ripple, leaving me alone with this downloaded understanding and the realization that I had been chosen not when I caught the fish, but years earlier when I'd rescued an unusual dolphin calf that had beached itself during a storm. They had marked me then as someone who respected the boundaries between worlds. The singing began again, now clearly emanating from beneath my boat, rising from immeasurable depths. Not one voice, or even several, but hundreds harmonizing in patterns that resonated with something deeply human while remaining fundamentally other. The melancholy and invitation I'd noted before were now joined by reassurance, promises of belonging, of purpose, of experiences beyond ordinary human comprehension. I found myself leaning over the side, hands trailing in water that felt warmer than it should have at this depth and season. The depths below my boat seemed to shimmer with soft lights ascending, patterns of bioluminescence forming recognizable shapes. Arms reached up, not human arms exactly, but appendages with too many hands and fingers, extended in welcome rather than threat. Faces with multiple vertical pupilled eyes gazed up through the water that should have distorted, but somehow didn't. The singing surrounded me now, inside and outside my consciousness simultaneously. I wish I could describe the moment of decision with clarity, but memory blurs here. Did I deliberately lower myself into the water, or was I guided? Did I feel fear or transcendent peace? Did I struggle against water, filling lungs that would soon transform? Or did I welcome the transition from one state of being to another? These details matter less than what I've become, less than the understanding I now carry and am permitted to share in this singular communication. I speak through channels those who found me will never fully comprehend, using the last remnants of individuality before complete integration. My boat was discovered the following morning, adrift and empty, save for wet footprints leading decisively toward the stern and into the water. Knossos' coin lay in the center of the deck, a deliberate placement my former self made as acknowledgement and farewell. The authorities have constructed their expected narratives: accident, despair, disorientation. Let them find comfort in explanations that maintain their world's familiar boundaries. But to those who feel the ocean's pull, who sense something watching from beneath the surface when they swim in deep water, who hear fragments of unfamiliar melody carried on sea breezes, receive this as both invitation and warning. The choice, when offered, is irrevocable. Choose wisely when the singing calls your name. Milky white. There are moments that divide our lives into distinct chapters, before and after. For some, it's meeting their life partner or the birth of a child. For others, perhaps a career achievement or personal loss. For me, it was a seemingly innocent decision 3 months ago to explore the ancient ruins of Delphi under the cover of night. I've hesitated to share this experience, partly from fear of judgment, partly from the profound difficulty of translating something so deeply personal into words. But perhaps in sharing, I might find some clarity, some path toward acceptance of what I've become. My journey to Greece had been meticulously planned for months. A solo adventure, born from my lifelong fascination with ancient civilizations. As a history buff, with a degree in classical studies gathering dust, while I worked an unfulfilling tech job, this trip represented reconnection with abandoned passions. Delphi had always held particular fascination for me. The concept of the Pythia, the oracle who delivered prophecies while intoxicated by vapors rising from a chasm in the earth, seemed to exist in that tantalizing boundary between historical record and mythology. Scientific explorations had even discovered geological faults beneath the temple that could have released ethylene gas, potentially explaining the trance-like states reported in historical accounts. I arrived in the small modern town of Delphi in early evening, checking into a modest guest house with a view of the valley. The archaeological site closed at 7 o'clock p.m., and I dutifully toured it before closing, taking in the Temple of Apollo, the ancient theater, and the stadium with appropriate tourist reverence. But something felt incomplete, the experience too curated, too removed from the mystery that had drawn me there. The ancient pilgrims approached Delphi with awe and trepidation, my tour guide had explained earlier that day. They came seeking divine insight, often traveling for weeks, purifying themselves along the sacred way. They weren't casual visitors. They were supplicants approaching a threshold between worlds. His words lingered as I sat on my hotel balcony that evening, gazing at the floodlit ruins visible in the distance. Modern tourism had sanitized the experience, stripping away the ritual and mystery that were intrinsic to what Delphi had meant to the ancients. The decision formed gradually, rather than in a single moment. I would experience Delphi as it was meant to be experienced, alone, in darkness, approaching with reverence rather than as a consumer of historical entertainment. Just after midnight, I made my way through the small town, following a less traveled path that skirted the official entrance to the archaeological site. Security was minimal, a fence easily scaled at a point where it met the hillside. My heart raced with the transgressive thrill of trespassing, but I rationalized that I meant no harm, would touch nothing, only wanted to experience the sacred site in solitude. The moon was nearly full that night, casting the ruins in silver blue light, transforming familiar structures I'd photographed hours earlier into something otherworldly. Without tourists and guides, without informational placards and designated pathways, Delphi reclaimed something of its ancient power. I moved carefully up the sacred way, the ancient path that wound through the sanctuary, trying to imagine myself as a pilgrim from millennia past. The Temple of Apollo, center of the complex and home to the oracle, stood in partial ruin atop its massive foundation. During the day, it had been roped off, visitors permitted only to look from a distance. Now, I approached without barrier, feeling the worn stone beneath my fingers as I navigated by moonlight. The Adyton, the inner sanctuary where the Pythia would have prophesied, was no longer intact, but archaeological evidence indicated it had been built around a natural chasm. I moved slowly through the foundation stones, trying to gauge where that sacred space would have been. What happened next still challenges my understanding. I felt a subtle shift in air pressure, a barely perceptible change that made my ears pop. Then, beneath a fallen column, partially obscured by shadow, I noticed what appeared to be disturbed ground. Not the result of archaeological excavation, but something more recent. Moving closer, I discovered a narrow fissure in the earth, perhaps 12 inches wide, extending into darkness. Most strikingly, the air above it shimmered slightly, like heat rising from sun-baked asphalt. Except the night was cool, the stones retaining none of the previous day's warmth. I should have stepped back, should have maintained appropriate tourist distance. Instead, I knelt beside the opening, compelled by the same curiosity that had always driven me toward ancient mysteries. A faint, sweet scent rose from the darkness, not unpleasant, but unusual, reminding me vaguely of overripe fruit with metallic undertones. I leaned closer, dangerously close in retrospect, peering into the fissure. The shimmer in the air intensified, and the scent grew stronger, seeming to bypass my nose and register directly in my brain. My first indication that something was wrong came when I tried to pull back and found my body unresponsive. Not paralyzed exactly, but unwilling to obey my increasingly panicked commands to move away. Instead, I found myself taking a deep, involuntary breath, drawing the vapors deep into my lungs. The effect was immediate and profound. The ruins around me seemed to simultaneously sharpen in detail and dissolve at their edges. Colors that shouldn't have been visible in moonlight bloomed in my vision. Deep purples, vibrant greens, colors I have no names for. Most disorienting was the sensation that time had become elastic, stretching and compressing around me. Through this disorientation came sound, a voice speaking in what I recognized as ancient Greek. Despite my academic background, my knowledge of the language was rudimentary at best, yet I understood every word with perfect clarity. Erkite apomakria, navri aftoputhen gnorizi otianazita, the voice said. He comes from far to find what he does not know he seeks. The voice had no clear source. It seemed to emanate from the fissure, from the air around me, from inside my own mind simultaneously. I tried to respond, but found my voice uncooperative, producing only a soft whimper. Vlepo to paralthonsu ketomelonsu. It continued, I see your past and your future. What followed was the most intimate violation I've ever experienced. The voice began to describe details of my life no stranger could know. My childhood home, with the crooked pine tree outside my window. The name of my first pet. The unfinished letter to my father I'd been drafting for years but never sent. You will lose yourself in darkness for 3 days, the voice said. When you return, you will carry me with you. Your eyes will cloud. Your voice will speak truths you cannot know, and others will come to hear what flows through you. The voice described events yet to unfold, specific, detailed predictions about my immediate future that seemed both inevitable and impossible. It spoke of transformations, of becoming a vessel, of strangers seeking me out for words of prophecy. This is the price of trespassing in sacred spaces, the voice concluded. Its tone neither malevolent nor benevolent, simply matter of fact. The oracle must always speak. The conduit changes, but the voice remains. It has always been so. I have fragmented memories of what followed, of collapsing beside the fissure, of fever dreams filled with symbols and geometric patterns that seemed to contain profound meaning just beyond my grasp, of voices speaking in languages I shouldn't understand, but somehow did, of knowledge flowing into me like water into parched earth. I awoke 3 days later in a hospital in Athens, having been found unconscious at the archaeological site by the morning security staff. The official diagnosis was dehydration combined with exposure, though the doctors seemed puzzled by certain aspects of my condition they couldn't quite explain. My eyes, once hazel, had turned a milky white, though strangely, my vision remained perfect. Better than perfect, in fact, as I no longer needed the glasses I'd worn since childhood. Blood tests revealed unusual chemical markers that prompted several specialists to visit my room, though no conclusive explanations were offered. Most concerning was what happened when the nurse first asked me how I was feeling. I opened my mouth to respond that I was confused but otherwise fine. But what emerged instead was a fluid stream of ancient Greek saying, "Your daughter's fever will break tonight. The shadow on her lungs will recede. She will live a long life, but beware the water when she turns 16. The nurse dropped her clipboard, backing away in obvious distress. Only later did I learn that her 4-year-old daughter had been hospitalized with pneumonia, her condition deteriorating despite aggressive treatment. That was the first prophecy. It hasn't been the last. The transition back to normal life has been challenging. I returned to my apartment in Seattle, but maintaining regular employment became impossible as unexpected utterances would interrupt meetings or client calls. my voice shifting in timbre and cadence, delivering unsolicited predictions that proved distressingly accurate. Some colleagues were fascinated, others frightened. My manager suggested a leave of absence for health reasons, her expression making clear she considered me mentally unstable. I didn't fight it. How could I explain what I barely understood myself? The prophecies come without warning. I might be making coffee or reading when suddenly my consciousness recedes slightly, and words flow through me about strangers or loved ones, about world events or intimate personal matters. I've learned I'm merely the conduit, not the source. I have no control over when they come or what they reveal. Word has spread despite my attempts at privacy. First came friends seeking insights, then friends of friends, then strangers who'd heard rumors. They arrive with hopeful expressions and nervous laughter, skepticism giving way to stunned silence when the prophecies begin. Some truths are welcome: news of healing, reconciliation, unexpected joy. Others I wish I could withhold, foretelling of betrayal, illness, paths that lead to sorrow. I've learned to be gentle in delivery, but unflinching in content. The oracle speaks truth, without judgment, without cushioning blows. The most difficult aspect has been reconciling my former self, analytical, skeptical, firmly grounded in the rational, with what I've become. There is no scientific explanation for knowing a stranger's unspoken secrets, for seeing the branching paths of their possible futures, for speaking in languages I never studied. I've found an unexpected community, among others, who live at the edges of conventional experience. A retired linguistics professor who helps me translate the more obscure languages that sometimes emerge. A graduate student in classical studies who meticulously records the prophecies, finding patterns I'm too close to see. A meditation instructor who teaches me techniques to remain centered when the oracle speaks through me. There are moments I mourn my former life, the simplicity of being just one person rather than a vessel for something ancient and not entirely human. Yet I cannot deny that there is wonder alongside the burden. I experience consciousness differently now, less linearly, more connected to an underlying fabric that binds all things. If there's meaning in what happened to me, perhaps it's this: boundaries between past and present, between knowing and mystery, between self and other, are more permeable than we imagine. I stumbled through such a boundary that night in Delphi, and now exist partly on both sides. The myths were records. As a child growing up in suburban Michigan, I'd spend hours poring over mythology books, particularly drawn to the Greek stories of heroes and monsters. While other kids dreamed of becoming astronauts or firefighters, I envisioned myself uncovering ancient truths beneath layers of earth and time. That childhood fascination evolved into academic pursuit, a doctorate in Mediterranean archaeology with a focus on Bronze Age civilizations, and eventually to my position as a visiting researcher at the University of Crete. For 3 years, I'd been methodically analyzing obscure artifacts, finding patterns others had overlooked, publishing papers that gently challenged established narratives about this sophisticated yet enigmatic culture of this island. What I never expected was how a simple structural assessment of Knossos would transform everything I understood about history, reality, and my own place within it. It began during the site's annual closure for maintenance and preservation work. As one of few researchers granted access during this period, I seized the opportunity to examine areas typically thronged with tourists. My colleague, Eleni, the site's structural engineer, had mentioned unusual readings from ground-penetrating radar in the western storage rooms, anomalies suggesting a larger void than documented in Sir Arthur Evans's meticulous excavation records from the early 1900s. Evans was thorough, but technology reveals what human eyes cannot, Eleni said, as we made our way through the quiet complex that January morning, our footsteps echoing in corridors usually filled with tour group chatter. The imaging suggests a significant space approximately 3 meters below this section. The western storage rooms were utilitarian spaces, less reconstructed than other areas of Knossos, and therefore closer to their authentic ancient state. Monitoring equipment had been temporarily removed for calibration, giving us rare access to the original flooring. Could it be a previously undocumented storage area? I suggested, running my hand along the cool stone wall, feeling the subtle texture left by craftsmen working their trade nearly 4,000 years ago. Eleni shook her head, consulting her tablet. The void extends far beyond the palace bounds. Initial readings suggest corridors, possibly extensive ones. She hesitated before adding, "Frankly, it makes no architectural sense given what we know about local construction principles." We spent hours meticulously examining the room, tapping on floor sections, noting subtle differences in acoustic response. Near the southwest corner, partially hidden beneath a modern support beam, we discovered what appeared to be a seam in the stonework. A perfect square, approximately 1 meter across. Its edges so precisely cut, they were nearly invisible without raking light. "This doesn't appear in any documentation," I murmured, excitement and scholarly caution warring within me as I photographed the finding from multiple angles. Eleni knelt beside me, running her fingers along the seam. "It's not Evans' work. His reconstructions have a different signature. This is original." She glanced at me, professional reserve momentarily eclipsed by excitement. This could be significant. We sought and received emergency permission to investigate further, assembling a small team of specialists. After careful documentation, we removed the modern beam and confirmed our suspicion. The square section was indeed a trapdoor, sealed with such precision that not even time had created significant gaps. The process of opening it required exquisite care. Pressure sensors monitored structural stability, while we gradually inserted specialized tools around the edges. When it finally lifted, revealing a perfect square of darkness below, the air that escaped carried a scent I'll never forget. Not the musty odor of long enclosed caverns, but something crisp and somehow alive, like the moment before a thunderstorm. Our initial inspection revealed a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness, its craftsmanship matching the finest examples of Minoan masonry. Archaeological protocol dictated careful assessment before proceeding. Air quality testing, structural evaluation, thorough documentation. But even as we followed these procedures, I sensed we were approaching something that would upend established understanding of the Minoan civilization. The construction suggests this wasn't merely utilitarian, I noted, as we prepared for descent 2 days later. The precision exceeds even the ceremonial spaces above. Our team had been reduced to just 4, Eleni, myself, Christos, who was our documentation specialist, and Dr. Papadakis, the site's archaeological director. Budget constraints and bureaucratic caution had limited our expedition, though in retrospect, perhaps something more instinctual had kept others away. The descent was steep but manageable, the staircase spiraling downward for what we calculated as 12 meters, far deeper than expected given the known geology of the area. The air remained surprisingly fresh, suggesting some unknown ventilation system. Our headlamps illuminated walls adorned with faint traces of pigment, once vibrant murals, now reduced to ghostly outlines. These don't match any known Minoan artistic themes, Dr. Papadakis observed, his voice hushed with professional reverence. The figures are different somehow. He was right. While recognizably Minoan in technique, the fragmentary images depicted unfamiliar scenes. Human figures with proportions subtly wrong, architectural elements that defied conventional understanding of Bronze Age construction capabilities, and recurring symbols absent from the established iconographic vocabulary. At the base of the staircase, the passage opened into a small chamber with 7 identical corridors branching outward like spokes of a wheel. Each corridor entrance was marked with distinct symbols carved with mathematical precision into the lintels. A hub-and-spoke design, Eleni murmured, already documenting the unexpected architecture, completely atypical for Minoan construction. Dr. Papadakis examined the symbols, his expression growing increasingly perplexed. These resemble linear A script, but the configurations are unknown. He photographed each lintel meticulously, already thinking ahead to epigraphy analysis. Which path should we explore first? Christos asked, his usual enthusiasm somewhat subdued in this unexpected environment. The decision was simple enough. We selected the corridor aligned most closely with north, meticulously mapping as we proceeded. The passage was tall enough to walk upright, its width allowing 2 people to move comfortably side by side. Every 50 meters, we placed small digital markers to track our path and ensure reliable communication with the surface team. The corridor extended straight for approximately 200 meters before making a precise 90-degree turn to the right. The consistency of construction remained remarkable. No structural degradation. No evidence of repairs or alterations, as if this space had been sealed since its creation and somehow preserved in perfect stasis. We continued methodically, documenting every architectural feature and faint artistic element. After another 100 meters and another perfect right-angle turn, Eleni stopped abruptly, consulting her mapping device. "This doesn't make sense," she said, her professional composure momentarily slipping. "According to these readings, we should be directly beneath the central court of Knossos. But that's impossible given our starting point and trajectory." Christos checked his own equipment. "The readings match. Either both devices are malfunctioning identically or—" Dr. Papadakis dismissed the fear lingering in the air with a scholarly wave. "More likely, we've miscalculated our position relative to surface landmarks. Let's continue with careful documentation and sort out the discrepancies later." We proceeded with renewed attention to mapping, taking redundant measurements and notes. Yet, with each turn, each new corridor, the discrepancies multiplied. Passages that should have intersected previously explored sections instead revealed new territories. Turns that should have directed us back toward our starting point somehow moved us further into unknown spaces. After 4 hours of exploration, Dr. Papadakis called for a return to the surface to reconcile our conflicting data. We began retracing our steps, following our digital markers. The path should have been straightforward: return along the same corridors in reverse order, making opposite turns at each junction. But something had changed. "This isn't the same corridor," Christos said, stopping suddenly before a section where the ceiling height noticeably decreased. "We didn't document any architectural transition like this." He was right. Our meticulous notes showed consistently high ceilings throughout our exploration. Yet here was undeniable evidence that our documentation had been flawed. "Equipment malfunction," Dr. Papadakis suggested firmly, though his voice carried less conviction than before. The markers might have shifted position. But our markers were exactly where we'd placed them, their digital signatures unaltered. We continued backtracking, increasingly disoriented as each familiar reference point appeared in unexpected configurations. Corridors we'd documented as straight now curved subtly. Junctions where we'd turned right now presented passages veering left. The digital map we'd created during our initial exploration no longer corresponded to the physical reality surrounding us. "This is impossible," Eleni whispered, professional detachment crumbling as she compared her current readings with our earlier documentation. "These spaces cannot physically exist where they appear to be." After 7 increasingly disorienting hours, we finally reached what should have been our starting chamber with its 7 corridors. Instead, we found ourselves in a vast circular room we hadn't encountered before, its ceiling lost in darkness beyond our headlamp's reach. The walls featured intricate carvings, millions of interconnected lines forming patterns that seemed to shift subtly when viewed peripherally. Dr. Papadakis, visibly shaken but clinging to scientific methodology, suggested we establish a base in this room, conserve our resources, and attempt a systematic exploration after rest. The surface team, receiving our increasingly confused reports, was preparing a secondary expedition to locate us. Though our position readings made no logical sense relative to the known structure of Knossos, we settled into an uneasy rest period, each processing this impossibility in our own way. Christos obsessively reviewed our documentation, searching for the procedural error that must explain our situation. Eleni conducted repeated equipment diagnostics, finding nothing amiss. Dr. Papadakis withdrew into scholarly contemplation, occasionally muttering references to obscure texts that might provide context. I found myself drawn to the wall carvings, which increasingly appeared to be not decorative, but functional, perhaps a map or guide to this impossible space. As my colleagues rested, I traced the patterns with my fingertips, noting how certain configurations repeated with slight variations, creating a system that seemed almost linguistic. During our 6th hour in this circular chamber, as we prepared to begin systematic exploration of the 8 new corridors that had apparently replaced our original 7, we heard it for the first time. A sound so deep, it registered more as vibration than audible noise. It reverberated through the stone beneath us, a low, sustained growl that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Geological activity, Eleni suggested immediately, though her expression betrayed uncertainty. Perhaps subsidence or distant seismic movement. But as the sound gradually resolved into a pattern, 3 long reverberations, followed by 2 shorter ones, repeated at precise intervals, the geological explanation became increasingly implausible. This was not random seismic activity, but deliberate communication. For the next hour, we documented the pattern, noting subtle variations that suggested complexity beyond simple repetition. The vibrations appeared to interact with the wall carvings, causing certain sections to resonate at different frequencies, creating harmonics that shifted throughout the room. Then came the footsteps, distant at first, but unmistakable. Heavy impacts that echoed through corridors we couldn't identify, growing incrementally closer with metronomic regularity. Not human footsteps, which vary naturally in pace and pressure, but something larger, more deliberate, moving with purpose toward our position. "We need to move," I said quietly, gathering our essential equipment. No one argued. We selected a corridor at random, no longer concerned with mapping, but focused entirely on finding an exit. The passage sloped gradually upward, offering hope of returning to the surface. We moved as quickly as caution allowed, the distant footsteps maintaining their steady approach. The corridor branched repeatedly, forcing quick decisions without time for documentation. Our headlamps cast jumping shadows as we navigated increasingly complex architecture, spaces that transformed from recognizably Minoan to something older and more primal, where perfect geometric precision gave way to organic curves that suggested natural formation rather than human construction. Through it all, the footsteps continued their pursuit, neither accelerating nor slowing, maintaining the inevitable pace of something that was in no hurry whatsoever. As we kept moving, fragmented realizations began crystallizing in my mind. The impossible spatial configurations, the walls that seemed to rearrange themselves, the precision of construction that exceeded known Minoan capabilities. This was a labyrinth. The growing certainty of this realization must have shown on my face, because Dr. Papadakis gripped my arm as we paused at yet another junction. "You've connected the dots, too," he said quietly. Not a question, but a statement. The spatial anomalies, the perfect preservation, the sounds. He didn't finish the thought. Didn't need to. "The myths were records," I replied, equally quiet. "Not metaphors or exaggerations, but attempts to document something they couldn't fully comprehend." The footsteps had grown louder, close enough now that we could feel subtle vibrations through the floor with each impact, and with them came a scent, not unpleasant but utterly foreign, like sun-warmed stone combined with something organic, yet unrecognizable. Our path suddenly opened into another large chamber, this one dominated by a spiraling ramp that ascended toward natural light. Our first glimpse of the surface since beginning this impossible journey. Hope surged momentarily until we realized the light wasn't sunlight, but moonlight. Somehow, despite our timepieces showing only hours had passed, day had transformed to night. As we approached the ramp, the footsteps stopped abruptly. The ensuing silence felt more oppressive than the pursuit had been, charged with anticipation and awareness. From one of the chamber's 5 other entrances came the growl again, no longer distant or reverberating, but immediate and present. I won't describe what emerged from that darkness. Some experiences exist beyond language's capacity to convey, and some knowledge isn't meant for casual sharing. All I will say is that the minotaur of Knossos was never a myth. We escaped, Eleni and myself, through circumstances I'm still processing. We emerged not through the trapdoor where we had entered, but from a previously unknown cave entrance, 3 kilometers from Knossos, beneath a full moon that shouldn't have been in that phase, according to our calendars. As for Dr. Papadakis and Christos, bless their souls, I can only hope their pain was brief, as the monstrous horns gored the two and enormous hooves trampled them. I am ashamed to admit that I am grateful for the darkness, for my mind would not have fathomed the visuals of the horror that had transpired. Their screams, the snapping of bones like frail branches, the sounds alone will forever haunt me. The official report documents a previously unknown substructure with unusual spatial characteristics, with our more inexplicable findings relegated to appendices likely to be overlooked in academic review. The trapdoor has been resealed with reinforced concrete. The cave entrance collapsed and disguised. The entire area designated restricted for preservation purposes. No mentioning of our colleagues, perhaps to keep things under cover. But I know, Eleni knows, that such barriers are ultimately symbolic. What exists beneath Knossos has existed for millennia before human civilization, and will continue long after. It doesn't require our belief or acknowledgement.